Now we're going to move straight on to our final plenary session. And this is a real nice segue from the last one, because we heard a great deal about the importance of getting the financing mechanisms right. We're now going to move on to a specific session on climate finance and how to leverage the right kind of climate finance to shift towards sustainability. We've got an excellent panel, and I'd like you to welcome them one by one to the dais. First of all, Mr. Sanjay Mitra, Secretary of the Ministry of Road, Transport and Highways. Followed by Mr. Dinesh Sharma, the Special Secretary in the Department of Economic Affairs in the Ministry of Finance. Welcome, sir. And Mr. George Sibley, who's Minister Counsellor for Economic Affairs and Environment, Science and Technology, so he's got a handful, at the United States Embassy. And Mr. Suman Bery, who's formerly Chief Economist, Strategy and Business Environment at Shell International. And last but not least, the Chairman of TERI, Mr. Ashok Chawla. And our Chair, welcome again, Mr. Nitin Desai, Distinguished Fellow at TERI, former UN Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs. And I'll hand over to Mr. Desai for the...
Thank you. Well, welcome. This is our last plenary session of this very fine conference that we've had. And in many ways, it's a very interesting follow-up to the previous session. And I'll just try and place the finance issue in some context, in the context of what was stated earlier. The focus of the discussion in the previous session was largely on mitigation issues, which is understandable since we were talking energy. But there are dimensions of finance which deal with adaptation also, and some of you may find it useful to focus on that. Second, much of the discussion is on, if you like, supply-side options, fuel mixes, etc., financing for renewable energy and so on. But I equally heard from all of them the importance of demand-side management. And that also is something which poses certain challenges of finance. So it's not just a question of looking at generation issues, but also the issues about on the demand side, which we would have to address. And I'm very happy that Mr. Sanjay Mitra is here, because in many ways his job is on the demand side of on the mitigation front. Third, I would say that much of the focus, as we heard, is on the, if you like, the cost of finance for commercial activities, and that certainly is an issue, and that I hope some of them will touch. But we must also recognize that it isn't just private finance which has to deliver. There are many activities which will require public finance. And I think it's, for instance, upstream work on research may require public finance. I suspect that certainly most of the money on adaptation will have to be some form of public finance. And possibly you may also need some public finance for other areas of demand side management. And I think this is something that we ought to look at. I would also urge people to look at it in terms of the type of finance, that mechanisms that we need. Much of this can be done in the normal commercial way of finance that exists. But do we need also some things which are more in the nature of venture capital? I must say that I was very interested in this. I was on the board of the original IRENA, which was set up 35 years ago, which was perhaps India's first venture funding arm for renewable energy that we had, which was about 35 years ago. So do we also need that? So I just wanted to place the finance questions in a slightly broader context, so that gives some leeway to people to deal with what concerns them most. We're going to begin with Mr. Ashok Chawla, who was, of course, our Secretary of Economic Affairs, later head of the Competition Commission, and now, of course, chairman of TERI. I would suggest that after that, we move to Mr. Sanjay Mitra, who can bring in the domestic dimension, more fully. And he is, of course, the Secretary, Surface Transport, and, well, it's a long title. And, but before that, he was Chief Secretary in Bengal. And we heard a story about Sundarbans in the previous session. The other three, in a sense, bring a broader perspective which goes beyond government. I have next to me Suman Bery. Suman was the World Bank. Later, he headed the National Council of Applied Economic Research. And for the past 4 years, he worked as the chief economist of Shell International. He's now back in India and is getting involved in a whole range of activities which are germane to this whole issue that we are discussing here. We have Mr. Dinesh Sharma, who is in the Department of Economic Affairs and pretty heavily involved in basically India's interface with global financing mechanisms. And I'm very happy that Mr. George Sibley is here, because the whole area of international, this is a major area in the cooperation between India and the US, both on the financing side as well as on the technology side. And I hope you can bring in that dimension as to the role that this type of cooperation will play in future. So let me just begin with Mr. Ashok Chawla. May I suggest people stay within around 5 minutes or so, and then they can ask each other questions.
Thank you, sir. My fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, climate finance, very central to all that we have discussed in the last 3-4 days, central to the entire architecture, yet difficult. One of those things which has been talked about for as long as we've been focusing on the area of climate finance. But there's not that much yet to show by way of results, either globally or at the level of different countries and at the micro level. I think the reason is not far to seek. New, difficult areas which hold a promise but may not be entirely economically, commercially viable, tend to have difficulty in raising resources. And when one is looking at the global level in terms of the architecture between developed countries and developing countries and how much should flow and so on and so forth, which has also been a part of the debate on this subject, the attitude always is wait and watch. Let's see what the others are putting on the table. How much is being put by multilaterals? How much is going to be put by the developed countries? So people are not easily going to write checks and put their money on the table. The requirements, there are different sets of numbers depending on what one takes as assumptions and what kind of models one runs, but that's not important. The point is that the requirement is very large, very huge. The commitments, particularly when one looks at from the developed countries to the developing countries, the commitments have been grudging. They have been limited. If one looks at the number of 100 billion as part of the Copenhagen conference, then we know what that number is. And in any case, how it's going to flow, what is going to happen is still not very clear. But let me, with that larger sort of picture of lots of pieces yet to fit into the puzzle, let me touch on some specific issues in relation to the requirements, the demand side on the ground level, particularly in a country like India. The first is, and this is applicable more when one is looking at finance from the market, the issue is risk reduction. The first issue is if we are able to, if there is a certain amount of, as was mentioned in the previous session too, if the perception of risk goes down, then it's slightly easier and it's more possible to raise money from markets. The World Bank showed the way in the form of green bonds with managing of risk, and that has now been taken up by commercial banks who are able to raise money through what are called green bonds which are intended for specific projects in the area of sustainable development and climate change. The second is cheaper finance. It may be possible in many areas which are opening up to get money, to source money. Renewable energy, for instance, in India, may not be very difficult to raise money. It's also included, I believe, in priority sector lending by the regulator. So availability may not be a problem, but the issue is at times, what is the kind of cost? What does the borrower have to pay? And if it's going to be near commercial or commercial terms, to that extent, it makes it more difficult. So this is something which needs to be looked at. And thirdly, in terms of funds, which are debt funds, etc., for projects which link up last mile. For instance, you have a renewable kind of architecture, but you need to take it off the grid to the households. What are the kind of, what are the entities which are going to, let's say, operate those schemes? They may have some money of their own, but they need to raise money. Are those debt funds available? What is the cost, etc.? This is another area which needs to be looked at, is very important, particularly from the point of view of India. And finally, at the enterprise level, enterprises which are forward-looking, and we had an example yesterday where one of the enterprises has declared, in keeping with the fast-catching global practice, to fix an internal carbon price of $10, as was mentioned, which means that you're basically setting aside money where you have the capability, but you look forward and you set it aside for innovation, research, etc., so that down the road, things become much better. These were the nuts and bolts. At the macro level, Mr. Dinesh Sharma is here. I'm not very sure about the existing architecture, but perhaps what is needed is at the level of the government, because there will be need for governments to come in, for public finance to play a role, whether domestic or coming from international sources, in addition to what the markets can raise or markets can provide. There probably is need, or its time is appropriate to have a focused, if not a department, certainly a very active wing in the finance ministry, which coordinates all activities relating to financing concerning sustainable development and climate change. Not just dealing with multilateral on the one hand, another department dealing with financial institutions and banks, but probably putting it all together would lead to synergies in terms of delivery and in terms of getting the act together. Having said this, I think it's also important to recognize that once these are activities in areas where once there is a certain amount of critical mass which is reached in terms of the size of a particular activity, it's the first few $1 billion which are important. After that, I think the activity takes on a dynamism of its own. So we really need to get to that critical mass, at the critical level, for then to go into the auto mode at the earliest. Finally, let me just touch on another aspect which is not really related to finance, but critical for implementation is institutional capacity. And I think that is equally important. TERI has been playing a proactive role in that regard, both domestically, but more so through the ITEC program of the Government of India for countries which need technical assistance. Because ultimately, to deliver, one important piece of the architecture has to be institutional capacity, and that's where TERI has played a role, will continue to play a role. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Sanjay?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Not so long ago, I was working in a provincial government, West Bengal, and I would like to bring some perspective from what is happening at the ground level. Unfortunately, it takes a very long time for pledges and flows and commitments to translate into projects on ground. We need to do something to shorten this gap. We also need to, ensure that the financing plan is followed up by the development of a shelf of projects, of a set of projects which will be in a position to absorb this money within a given time frame. Just to give you an example of the $10.2 billion that was pledged for the Green Climate Fund, about 60% has been converted to contribution agreements. Latest information indicates that about $150 or $160 million worth of projects have been sanctioned. So there is clearly a big gap between what is promised and what actually flows. I'm not saying anything, I'm not describing any motives, but the point is we are often not prepared to absorb this money, and the quality of the state climate adaptation plans leaves much to be desired. And there I would seek assistance from, now of course I've changed my jobs, but we would have been very happy to get assistance from somebody who would tell us how to prepare a good climate adaptation plan rather than simply going in for some more construction projects. We'll probably, in a country like India, we'll probably have to depend a lot on our own money and not really hope for much inflows from multilateral bodies or for other organizations. We have a large number of initiatives, the National Clean Energy Fund, and we have a lot of CDM projects too going on. So we need to probably concentrate on our own money, and as Dr. Desai had said, probably the public sector will have to pitch in substantially. For transformative change, we need to ensure that the project cycle becomes smaller and the project starts really working. I just said this, that the National Action Plan for Climate Change has approved only 6 projects at an estimated cost of about rupees 1 billion. But project work needs to begin soon. The PAT initiative, which Dr. Mathur had led, was very good. It had shown quick results in a very short span of time. That was because of the nature of the project. It was very well focused. It was concentrated on the industrial sector. You could do a project quickly and get out. Unfortunately, the state level intervention is likely to be very diffuse, much more long term, and will probably require a different verification mechanism. One of the key aspects of PAT was the very strong verification mechanism through the energy audit process. I don't know what to do about this, but I'd leave it open to the House to deliberate and maybe come out with some ideas. I currently deal with transport, and I have 2 ideas which I'd like to share with you, where we probably need a lot of help. Heavy commercial vehicles account for 60% of the particulate matter emissions in the country. They are only 2.5% of the total vehicle fleet. We've been thinking about a voluntary vehicle or a fleet modernization program where an owner of an old vehicle, which is say 15 years old, is incentivized in a particular manner to shift to a newer vehicle. So originally our funding mechanism was based a lot on tax and other tax incentives, but post GST we have to think anew. This is a place where there can be a focused intervention of development finance from various agencies, and which will have a quick yield prospects of making a serious impact on the quality of, on climate issues as well as on the pollution issues. I don't know how to go about it. We have been, there is a school of thought which says go the regulatory way and mandate that all vehicles should be taken off. I'm very skeptical about this because we are not very good at implementing these kind of, strong programs. The other was incentivized through OEMs who would contribute, the car manufacturers. There should be some aspect from the scrap value, and now there seems to be some role for development finance which should be channelized to the sector. The other one was, transport sector has a very unrecognized and kind of unsung aspect, which is the state road transport undertaking. They're much vilified, but their data is astonishing. They move a total of 7 crore passengers, 70 million passengers a day across the country. That is 3 times the number that moves on the railways. And they are actually don't get much attention at all. They have about, all told, 150,000 buses, of which about 30% need replacement. This again is a place where you can solidly look at about $15 billion rupees program, which can make a significant impact on the quality of public transport. I mean, you basically replace your aging fleet, which are based on, fossil fuel, with electric or hybrid or CNG or LNG. So this is something we have been working on in the Transport Ministry, and we've had some discussion with the state governments. And I would be very happy if a gathering like this, if people involved in such gatherings, help us by telling us how to go about and give us a proper roadmap. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay. I'm very happy that you brought in the demand side and how can one generate. You talked of the HCVs, but I understand there is a panel that now they have decided to look into HCV standards, that the sort of standards we have for light vehicles, Bharat 6, etc. Yeah, but at least for one step, I can assure you it was a very tough fight. I was involved in it from trying to promote it, and it took a long time. It took about 2-3 years to get that done. But one point I wanted to stress from what he's saying is the capacity to spend. It's not just amounts of money, but actually the capacity to spend. In a small way, I was involved in trying to push out about, not a very large sum, about roughly $10 million for policy research. It took us 2 or 3 years to build up the capacities to actually do that sort of work. Now it's not a problem, but it does this aspect that don't assume that there is a capacity to spend at the ground level already. A lot of work, there has to be a build-up. It can't be done just on a grand scale all the way. Suman, would you like to touch on also on the whole issue of, we focus so much on the economics on the financing side, but can we separate that from what may be distortions on the pricing and market side?
Thanks, Nitin. Do I have to do something?
No, you don't have to do anything.
Well, let me thank the organizers for having me here, and let me reinforce what Nitin says, that I'm here with my Indian hat on. I was formerly with Shell, but these views have nothing to do with Shell. Nitin, just to respond to your challenge, let me provide a little bit of structure and then provide some views. I have to say that those views are to some extent.
Perhaps take the podium.
Is this any better? Or? Yes? Okay, it's difficult to tell from here. I did do some work on Indian energy while at Shell, and some of those views are reflected here. Firstly, just schematically, I think that because of the IFCCC, a lot of the focus in climate finance has been on the cross-border issues, but I tend to agree with Sanjay that really for us it is the domestic finance issues that are important and pressing, and I hope to make that point. I think the point that you made of public versus private is another useful segmentation. So I think that really some of this discussion, at least, ought to be about, as it were, the domestic challenge, public and private. However, let me just say that on the cross-border side, the old UNFCCC kind of argument used to be that, look, the rich countries have messed things up. They have used up the carbon space. They, quote unquote, owe it to the poor countries to finance what is going to be an expensive transition. I'm not sure that that logic has survived post-Paris. What I would say, though, is that if it has any logic, it has more logic in the area of adaptation than mitigation. So I'll just make that point. I'll leave it to others to perhaps pick it up. And I'm going to talk a little bit now on the domestic challenges. Domestically, I do think that the issues, the analytic issues, are of two kinds. One is sheer uncertainty, technological uncertainty, but dare I say also regulatory uncertainty. The question of what are efficient instruments for dealing with
regulatory uncertainty, technological uncertainty, and market uncertainty, I think is the way that we should be thinking about the challenge. And I'll come to some suggestions on that. But in all of this, we are increasingly connected with the global market. And the question of fossil price predictability, fossil price risk, and what that actually means to renewable projects being in the money, I think is a large issue. And I'm not sure, I wasn't able to attend previous sessions about whether that's been taken up already or not. Let me just give you a little example in the limited time I have about the micro sets of issues that come up, and just begin to a process of thinking about what might be solutions to these. So I was at another event that was going on in town in this crazy Desai week. I think we both, we feast on vegetables at night and on ideas during the day during Navratri. It's essentially of an entrepreneur who is trying to come up with a kind of a prepaid model for solar energy in UP. I believe, I don't need to give the name of the company. And the issues are what you would expect, that as far as the villages are concerned, there is the issue of delivery risk by the, by the company. Will the local agent be there? Will they deliver? Because there is an upfront cost. And from the point of view of the firm that's trying to make a go of this, there's the question of credit risk of the final purchaser. The point is that this is what economics calls wicked problems, and I'm wondering what the nature is of guarantee intermediaries who could get over the uncertainty so that, as it were, there could be a credit enhancement mechanism, a guarantee enhancement mechanism. I'll stop at this point simply to say that to focus on the big flows of 100 billion cross-border is fine, that's what negotiators need to do, but getting the problem solved may need a lot more thought and imagination domestically.
I think he has raised a very important question, what is called fossil price risk. And I can see we are facing it right now. We've been given lots of numbers on how the cost of renewables is coming down. But we should also recognize that with what has been happening to gas and petroleum prices, those prices are also coming down. And I've already
probably stimulated by the first.
Yeah, and in fact, I've already received a paper from a friend abroad which says that it is going to be easier for India to meet its carbon obligations under Paris by switching to gas rather than going in for renewables.
Well, our mutual friend Charles Frank.
So it's all. And second, stranded assets. Do you think the people who have brought those fossil fuel resources onto the balance sheets are going to sit back? Because if you are serious about what we are of Paris, then perhaps half the oil which is there underground will have to remain underground, and maybe even much more, maybe even 3/4 of the coal will have to remain underground. But that stuff is already on people's balance sheets. So are they just going to sit back? Or are they going to really ensure that prices crash? And that would also change the competition. So I think that point of fossil price risk is a very crucial one, and I don't think we have fully recognized how to handle it in the way in which we aim to achieve our long-term targets. Well, India will be easier. We have such a lousy pricing system that we can probably do what we want anyhow. But Dinesh, would you like to come in on the international dimension which I presented?
Okay. Can I stand there?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's, I find it more convenient to stand and speak. And thanks to my previous speakers, I don't have much to speak now. But since I've been described as a person who deals with the global aspect of it, and thanks to Mr. Chawla, he said that I know about the macro picture, I'll be able to speak about it. Thanks for reposing that much of faith in me.
but I'll stick to the questions which were given before this meeting in the concept note. How big is the gap in climate finance to stay below the 2 degrees centigrade benchmark? And this is a question which everybody is looking for answers, and so many people have found answers, and the answers are so large that there's no point in quoting those figures here. It's huge. It has been mentioned by many people, runs into trillions. So when you talk about trillions and when the arrangements which have been made so far, the largest of arrangements which are made so far, or commitments made so far, or indications given so far, do not touch even hundreds of billions, then there's no point in doing that exercise and saying whether it is 2.5 trillion or 3.1 trillion over what period of time. And these are based on assumptions made by the person who did the studies. So I'm not talking about that gap. I'm not competent. Whatever figures are available are there on the net. All of you must have seen them and wondered, how will you reach there? My advice would be, don't look at those figures because they are kind of unreachable in the foreseeable future in which we matter. The second big issue about this is what are the constraints to access the public finance in meeting this target? What are the constraints? Every finance man knows what are the constraints. The money is not available, that's the constraint. The constraint is the availability of money in the public domain. I'm talking about public finance. The governments all over the world do not have the money of the type which is being mentioned in all these studies to be provided for having a sustainable development. That brings the role of climate finance going to play in addressing the estimated 2.5 trillions. That brings to the second point which I have mentioned here and which I wanted to share with you. It's the lack of clarity. It's not just the total amount of numbers. It's the lack of clarity about almost everything under the sun on this particular issue. They are very, very knowledgeable people. I am one of them who is the least knowledgeable. My familiarity with this subject is only about less than 2 years old. And I thought I'll be wiser after this 1.5 years passed. I'm less knowledgeable, I'm less certain, I'm very unclear, I don't understand. Every time I try to understand, but with a normal, intelligent person cannot understand the things which get talked about in international fora on this great subject. So there's a lot of people talk about green finance, people talk about climate change. Just to give you an example that I'm not the only person who is unclear about it. In G20, this is one of the standard subjects. There is a working group, CCWG, Climate Change Working Group. This year, last year, only China presidency wanted a green finance working group. Green Finance Working Group, whatever the short form of it. So there is a working WGCC and there is a WGGF working group of green finance. And the person who had suggested for that separate group, finally, the minister representing that country ended up mixing the two speeches which were to be given on these two different working groups and didn't know what to speak about and ended up, yes, I have already spoken. Then they said, no, this is now you are not talking about the CCWG, now you are talking about the Green Finance Working Group. So what I'm saying is nobody knows what is that green. People talk about green bonds. I'm looking after this subject for quite some time. If you ask me what is a green bond, I'm sorry, I won't be able to answer very correctly. I'll try to do some guess, I'll try to throw some jargon here and there, but I'm not clear about what actually qualifies to be. I know the principle, I understand what the objective is, but what actually should be called as green finance and what should be called not so green finance, there's a lot of lack of clarity. We are all groping in this green wood. The third point, I'll finish it, I have only 4 points. The third point is the economics and politics of it. This also stems from the subject given to me. It looks like the politics is very strong in this particular matter. Economics may not be so strong. Politics is very, very, very strong. I'm on the board of GCF, and the first meeting I attended, I got a lot of indoctrination by one of my members, friends. This is not, you come from the Ministry of Finance, forget about what you learned about finance. This is what we have got after fighting for last 10 years. We will not let even a single pi or paisa or penny spent for something which it is not meant to be. And that's my answer to what Mr. Mitra raised it here. We are we target 100 billion, we reached up to 10 billion. But for spending a pie out of it, there has to be consensus between developing countries and developed countries, and both of us are very knowledgeable people, I'm saying. I'm coming back to this. If you are ignorant, perhaps you would have moved faster. There's a lot of baggage. There's a lot of things which we carry. There's a lot of legacy of the past. And that's the difference between maybe the global and the local or whatever. Locally, things can be done. Globally, it is almost impossible. All these climate finance negotiations and whatnot reach up to 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning. We have had an agreement which is we are very happy about, but which is a very good sign because it's an agreement. And that's the only thing which is good about it, that it's an agreement. I don't think it is anything beyond that, but the fact that we could reach an agreement is a measure which should give us happiness. It's a symbol that we at least agreed to do something, which is good, but money doesn't come by just political agreements. It may lead to something, but people don't put money unless they can get it back. That brings to the economics. What is a good sign is that it's good business also, like the first session, which I heard part of it, and all my cynicism went away immediately because everybody was so happy. We are doing this much solar, this much that, and everybody was so confident, and that's a good sign. It's good economics. It's not, even without any political agreement, even without any Paris agreement, I am sure we would have gone for the solar thing if the prices of the solar panels had come down. And if the price of fossil fuel, which is very important, if it goes down, we may keep on polluting again for a longer period because it will be sustainable economically. It may not be sustainable for the climate, but if the prices come down, we'll be happy to gorge. So that's the economics and politics of it. I think politics, I'm just to put my cards straight on the table, I'm a student of political science first, economics later. So my allegiance is for politics. Whenever the flag goes, I go after it. I don't question anything else. But I realize I live in a real world. Most of us have to realize it, that money will not come. This particular session is for money. Money will not come unless it makes sense to put money in something. It can come only when somebody forces. That brings to the law, rules, implementation, forcing. The politics can force spending of money in this particular sector, but nobody will do it out of charity. Neither the developed countries will do it out of charity or the developing countries will do out of charity. So that was my third point. Fourth part is, yes, we keep on talking about transformational projects, paradigm shift, big projects. I want to say that if we want to have any significant dent in this particular field of climate finance, we have to go for transformational projects, paradigm shift. These two words are also discussed. We took in the last GCF meeting almost perhaps 1 day to discuss what is a paradigm shift and what is exactly transformational. If we stop discussing it and we understand what is transformational and what is paradigm, if we stop tinkering here and there on small things, like the one big project, with that I'll end my this anecdotal. The one big project which the GCF cleared with lots of clapping around was throwing 35 million in an island somewhere where only 13,000 people live, not 13,000 families. That was the best. They said this is the type of things which is finance. I'm not against it. Throwing 35 million over 13,000 people, 13,000, which amounts to giving them money, which is, I calculated 6 years average per capita income of India. So a country like India, you can feed a person for 6 years, an average person for 6 years. This average is of Anil Ambani and the poorest person here. So with that kind of money thrown to throw some stones in the sea, to build a seawall. And we know seawall can be built and that nobody has ever been able to stop sea from coming by building a seawall. But this was the project which was cleared without a murmur, with everybody supporting, and all the other projects, because somebody will question all the decisions on this GCF have to be taken by consensus, things don't forward. So I'm just saying, if we don't think big, if we don't think about making changes which will make a real dent, then putting some money here, putting some money there, and arguing over it for hours together will not take us anywhere. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Sibley.
Thank you very much. Dinesh ji, you've more or less hit my first point right away, and that is one thing to understand about this and why it's so difficult to understand is that everything is changing. Everything is changing. If you come back to this conference in 5 years, the technologies we're talking about will be different, the financing mechanisms we talk about will be different, the diplomatic structures we talk about will be different. The state of the world will be different too. So it becomes extremely challenging within a world of such rapid change, even when we recognize the importance of that change, to decide how we're going to address it, what we're going to do. And unfortunately, in the dimension of finance, a natural reaction of private financiers is to avoid risk. And I've just described for you a situation of extreme risk. Risk to the physical world caused by climate change, global warming. Risk to understand where our diplomatic situation is going to be, what capacity we have to measure the activities we undertake and their effect, the technologies to address those problems, which are multifaceted. We have already discussed India's nationally determined contribution is a mix of a variety of different technologies, and there was the previous session described how perhaps the availability of solar and the relative unavailability of wind might make the mix in India different. And then the financial instruments that we have available to address this. So this is the challenge. Now, within these different areas of constant, continuous change, there is some good news and bad news. So in the physical world, the news is pretty bad. You had just pointed out a moment ago that the outcome of Paris won't solve the problem. That's quite clearly understood. As it stands now, if everyone lives up to their NDCs, we will not solve the problem. So the situation in the physical world is pretty bad. The situation on the diplomatic instruments used, I would disagree with you. I think the diplomatic instruments that we use are showing remarkable progress. There is a global consensus that this is a problem. It's a problem that's facing humanity, and we all have to address it together. And the good thing about the Paris Agreement is that it will be iterative. We will, as technology change, as all of these changes occur, there will be a process by which we will change how we address it, both in our financing and in our technology. Capacity to measure is improving all the time. And the technologies to address these problems. You know, Al Gore, who won a Nobel Prize for this stuff, if you listen to his speeches of 10 years ago, they're profoundly depressing. He is quite pessimistic about the future of our species on this planet. If you hear his speeches now, it's quite a different story. And that is in a very significant measure because of the improvements in technology. But finally, in terms of finance, and there, as I indicated, the situation in finance is not good. When you're talking about trillions, the financing available is much smaller. And a big part of that, it has to do with the unpredictability of fossil prices, the unpredictability of whether to invest in one or another instrument, not knowing where the technology may be in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years. So as change implies risk and capital avoids risk, what is needed is to sort of change the paradigm there. And here I come to the one issue you wanted me to raise, which is research. So there's at Paris there were two elements that go together, separate but they are linked. And one is mission innovation, which Prime Minister Modi actually named. And that is a commitment by the countries who do the most research and development, including the United States and India, to double their R&D on clean energy, on solving these problems. And the problem has always been and continues to be that how do you go from a science effort, a research effort, into a practical development and deployment effort? And so the other aspect of this is the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, which was launched by Bill Gates with his own money, not foundation money, and in which he got a number of very high net worth people around the world, including, I believe, Ratan Tata and Mukesh Ambani from India, to contribute funds. And the idea is to change the paradigm, which is to de-risk the threshold at which investment occurs, so that funds will flow to these new technologies in a way that might not otherwise. And the Breakthrough Energy Coalition has 5 precepts, all right? The first is invest early. That is to say, you don't wait and see who the winners and the losers are and then invest, but you invest early. The second is you invest broadly. Again, you're not picking winners and losers. You're giving a chance for all of them to compete and see who will come out most successfully. Third, invest boldly. We have a terrible problem. We cannot address it timidly. Fourth is invest wisely. When you think about $1 trillion, if you make a 1% mistake in your investment, you've thrown away $10 billion. It's quite a lot of money. And then invest together. We're all in this together. We need to invest together. I was going to talk a little bit about US and India, some of what we're doing together, but I'm looking at the time and seeing that I have unwisely invested my time too much on the general and not on the specific, but I'd be happy to take questions on that afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are overrunning, but they have been kind enough to allow us 2 or 3 questions. So may I see who's dying to ask a question? Nobody? Has the panel been that convincing? There's a gentleman there.
Good afternoon to everyone who's on the panel. So I have a question for the Secretary for for the Road and Highways. So sometime back, the government was planning on having a centralized or a decentralized solution where you would have two-wheelers which would be charged through solar energy. Like maybe have a centralized charging station or a parking station in a residential or an office complex. So you come in, you put your vehicles when you reach office. Throughout the day when the sun is charging, it charges your electric vehicles and you go back. And I'm an intern with TERI and I'm a master's student as well, and I'm thinking about incorporating this. What is yours and the government's idea about incorporating this in both in the rural and urban terms? Like you said, transport is a major source when it comes to pollution. So this way you're also getting to have the solar capacity installed. Good. And also help for the pollution control.
Good. Any other question? The only one? Good. Sanjay, that's obviously directed at you.
No.
Yeah, that's working.
This is, I agree with this, but the thing is that it has to be affordable and we have to actually set up that many charging stations. So I'm talking about a much smaller subset. I'm talking about 1.1 million vehicles. If you talk about two-wheelers, we are into numbers that are 10 times that number, maybe 20 times that number. So we really we don't have the infrastructure nor we have the capability to do the kind of thing that you're talking about, not at least in the near future. If we can get moving on the heavy vehicles, maybe in the years to come and we get sufficient number of sufficient interest in electric vehicles, then maybe the concept of charging stations for heavy vehicles, for passengers vehicles, and then for the two-wheelers can come through. Thank you.
None? I think basically, I'm glad we've overshot our time, and maybe the panel's been very convincing. I think overall what I would say is that we'll have to look at the financing challenge in terms of a broad structure. There will, of course, be the part which is dealing with the normal commercial financing of energy. We cannot separate what we do for renewables or for climate change from the broader picture of energy finance, which will be there. It will be part of the same market, the same capital market, the same product markets, etc. And we'll have to ask ourselves, what is it that is there in that system which distorts choices between, let us say, renewables and others, and address those choices. In India, our great problem is that we do not have a rational pricing system for energy. In fact, we don't have an energy market. It's all negotiated prices for just about every energy resource. We will, however, have to recognize that realizing the ambitious goals that we have on carbon reduction will require new technologies, new business methods, new modes of delivery, and that is where venture capital comes in. And venture capital is basically something which is an ecosystem which brings together the research, the technological research which is being done, the source of finance, and an entrepreneurship. All three have to be there. We've had it in IT. Now we need to duplicate that in other areas. And basically, that's your risk-sharing mechanism that you have. But it has to be something which looks at not just the production of energy, but most important in India, the distribution. I mean, we, I think, have done a reasonable job on the generation side. We are actually achieving most of our targets now on generation. But we have not, as somebody, I think, in the previous session they mentioned, that the balance between generation and distribution transmission should be 1:1. In India, it is 1:0.4. And there's gross underinvestment at the other end. And we'll have to ask ourselves as to how that also can be promoted. But I do want to emphasize one particular thing, and that is the continuing importance of public investment. I think Suman correctly pointed out that as far as adaptation is concerned, that is going to be very largely a matter of public investment. In fact, internationally also, it is basically an application of the polluter pays principle. Because what is adaptation? Adaptation is that you are asking somebody to cope with the changes which are being brought about because of climate change. And those changes are not that person's fault, it is somebody else's. So that it is necessary that the adaptation funding should be seen mainly in the broad philosophical framework of compensatory finance. But it's not just that. I think there's a crucial importance of public funding, particularly for risk reduction and at the upstream research end. I keep reminding, Google is perhaps the most spectacular example that we have of venture funding, where something which in 1998 started with a $100,000 grant from Sequoia has today one of the largest companies in the world. But look at the original paper of Lin and Page, from which Google has grown, which was the basis for Google, the search algorithm. There's a footnote at the bottom which thanks the fact that the funding for that research, which was in that paper, was provided by the National Science Foundation and the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. If those public sector funding institutions had not been there, it's quite likely that Lin and Page would not have been able to do their work. So do not underestimate the importance of public funding. And I would actually urge people to look at that, how shall I say, the primary example of free enterprise, which is the United States. It has the best and most largest system of public funding of research, including in renewable energy, which you can find anywhere else in the world. So,
if I might, I just would like to make one more point, and it has a little bit of levity as well. You're quite right that the role of the government in terms of triggering that research is very important. The other part of the role of the government is in terms of the policy environment. Setting a conducive policy environment also will de-risk the financing. And one of the things that my staff had gotten ready was some of the areas in which that can be done. And a very important one is on the enforceability and sanctity of contracts. And that's an area actually that unfortunately India and the ease of doing business does not score very well. But I'll tell you a very interesting thing. In giving me the papers here, the comment, the bullet says the enforceability and sanity of contracts. And I think that's important too.
No, we should, the enforceability of contracts is a matter for the weakness of our, the tardiness of our judicial procedures. And certainly there's lots of improvements we need to do on the ease of doing business, which will be relevant not just for this area, but for many other areas. But getting back to this, not to underestimate the importance of public funding, directed public funding, at things which require, which clearly have external benefits, like basic research, for instance, is, I think, what we have probably not done enough of. So I hope that the message that we take from here is, from the previous panel, we got the message that the goals that we have set for ourselves are readily achievable. In fact, we can probably do better. I think somebody said we can probably go to 400 gigawatts of solar, why not just 100? But I think the message from here is that we will need not just a financing system, but a policy framework for energy, which actually encourages correct choices to be made, a stable and predictable also, so that long-term investment decisions can be made. There are other aspects that I could deal with, for instance, the fact that our stock markets and the obsession with stock prices and quarterly results encourages a certain short-termism in the corporate boardrooms. And recently, Unilever the head of Unilever, is a major supporter of sustainable development. And he has unilaterally taken a decision that he will not put out quarterly results, so that this obsession about quarterly results does not dominate choices which are made within his corporation. But these are broader issues which apply not just to our problematic, which is the energy sector, but much more. So thank you very much. You have been a very good audience, not just for this session, but all. And I hand over for the benediction.